Welcome, fellow traveler, to phase 2 of the journey. The path to enlightenment begins from within and spreads outwards into the universe. As the universe is the manifestation of the essence of consciousness, no outward motion can occur without inward transformation. As such, it is up to you, the traveler, to unlock what awaits beyond the veil.
Improving the future by remembering and understanding the past is the topic of the hour with Edmund Marriage. And we're going to talk about the Shining Ones. Now, Edmund, you alluded to the Shining Ones in the last segment, but can you break it down for us? Who exactly were these Shining Ones?
Well, in the very earliest Christian documents, we have people who are called the Elohim, but it's used in a singular sense. So in the St. James's Bible, which is probably the best version of the translation from Latin to English, and of course it was translated from the Aramaic or the Hebrew, where all the words and letters were joined up. And we have a situation where over many different phases of translation, a lot of the material was in fact very scrambled and very difficult to understand. But the basic word Elohim, which was the word used for God singular in the St. James's Bible, and there is a footnote which says, oh yes, we know it's a plural word, but it's because of God's majesty, then we can use it as a single word rather than a plural word. And there are, in fact, about 24 different examples of a plural word, and there's Ha Beni Elohim, which meant the shining ones. So in reality, the problem we have is that the word God, in the earliest form, they're called, or he is called, Elohim, and Elohim meant the bright or shining ones. And it was not God in heaven, it was the bright or shining ones in the Hashemin. Now, Hashemin is a Hebrew word, and Hashemin has a root in the middle of that, which is Shem, and a Ha on the front, which is a plural, makes it a plural word. So it's Hashemin, which isn't heaven singular, but it's the planted highlands with that root of Shem, which means seed. So when we look at our actual history, told us in the church, told us by our priests, written in our Bibles, that it's God in heaven, it's not. It's the bright ones or shining ones in the planted highlands. And then the whole concept of religion takes a different form and different format. And so we find that the Elohim in the planted highlands was the site in the Levantine corridor, that's from Damascus down to Jericho, which was one of the first places to begin to warm up, particularly in the Jericho area, which was 1,300 feet below sea level, at the end of the Great Younger Dryas Ice Age, which was 9,500 BC. And all of a sudden, flowering out from that valley, the Levantine corridor, we find agricultural, settled communities, the success of agriculture and domesticated crops and domesticated animals. We find this revolution suddenly taking place, and the evidence for that comes from Jericho, because still remains an area which it was possible to excavate it and reach a lot of very important conclusions during the time of Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s, a great archaeologist. And lots of the features there are very important, and they form a base from the point of view of dating for Christian O'Brien's first book, first important book, which was called the Genius of the Few. And following the history from Jericho, which is recorded as the oldest town, we can see that that area of Lebanon and up to the Bekaa Valley, especially in the area below Mount Hermon, at the headwaters of the Jordan, and then a bit later on, the headwaters of Litani and the Orontes at Baalbek, where we're told the gods live at the headwaters of the Euphrates and Tigris. It wasn't. It was the Litani and Orontes. And then we can suddenly see that the Elohim in the planted highlands refers to this site below Mount Hermon and all that was going on in the Levantine corridor down to Jericho at about 9,500 BC. And we find that that technology delivered by archangels, angels, and watchers was delivered around the world over the next 2,000 years. So that's from 9,500 BC to 7,500 BC. We find the seeds, the crops, and many of the same seeds. We find actually maize, the first maize ever recorded close to Mount Hermon. We find that now that wheat and barley were being grown in the Americas, we find the remains of wheat and barley. So, and we find the millet, which is called now the Italian millet, but Italian millet was being grown in the area of northern China on the river Yangtze. And so we can suddenly see that we had a group of very clever, practical people restarting agriculture and taking civilization around the world at that early date. And they were survivors on this enormous catastrophe at 10,850, which was the Earth moving on its axis, massive vertical movements in the Earth crust. The whole world's surface was reformed. And they somehow managed to survive that period. And that catastrophe at 10,850, which is referred to by Richard Firestone in his book, The Cycles of Cosmic Catastrophe. We're talking about a supernova explosion, 49,000 BC, all the problems from that, big swings in temperature, right through to the solid debris coming through our planetary system and delivering great chunks of rock and ice and nitrogen, freezing the ground to 200 feet deep, so the mammoths were literally frozen where they stood, and the contents of their stomachs, we can tell now, were grazing grass in the northern areas of Siberia. So there's a fantastic history here for us all to be taught and to learn, and it's gradually coming through. But the educational establishment is a perfect example of group think, where you're not allowed to be a heretic or a pagan. And consequently, our children are not told the truth about many, many important things. And that is the great tragedy. Education should be about education, education, education. But no, we get nothing more than confusion, 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 and group think. Much the same way that we have this crazy idea that mankind can actually influence the climate of the planet. A beautiful example of the popular delusions and madness of crowds, all written about by Gustave Le Bon, a very important book.
Well, and any child that's grown up in any kind of religious upbringing will be taught that there was a great flood. And at the same time, there's also evidence of Plato with Atlantis. So let's bring those two together when we come right back here at Beyond the Veil with our guest, Edmund Marriage. did the real biblical flood really, truly happen? Scientists at first said, no, that's impossible for there to be that big of a flood. Then later on they said, well, maybe. If there was a big enough pole shift, if a huge piece of ice broke off from Antarctica, something could happen to cause a worldwide flood. Edmund Marriage is our guest, and we want to also get into Atlantis. Did Atlantis really, truly exist? Edmund thinks it did. Why do you think Atlantis existed, Edmund, and what's the scientific evidence for that?
Well, my guide has been Christian O'Brien and his wife Barbara Joy, who is my mother's first cousin. Christian O'Brien was one of the world's leading exploration geologists. When he first met my aunt, Barbara Joy, my second name is Patrick, and my uncle Pat, who's Barbara Joy's father, said, "What do you do, young man?" And Christian O'Brien said, "Well, I've been working out how far the Rocky Mountains have moved in the last 65 million years." And he had. His second book, he did the first book was all about salt and geology. The second book was literally how far the Rockies had moved in the last 65 million years. And having started as a young exploration geologist with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1936 in the Mesopotamian plains, not far from Susa, he not only had a great interest in archaeology, because going to that area, but also he had been somebody who really had studied the geology of the planet. He spent something like 7 months in the Azores, and he realized that the Azores was a very large area of land the size of Spain, which had sunk very dramatically, 2,000 feet on the north and maybe as much as 5,000 feet on the south. And that is all very clear and can be seen in detail on the Golden Age Project website, .org.uk, under Survey of Atlantis. And what he found was a hanging river bed, about 150 feet wide, a river which would have taken an area the size of Spain to form and for the rocks to have the degree of water erosion. And that hanging riverbed was on the southern coast of San Miguel. And following all the undersea contours and maps which were available through the Portuguese, he could see from the geological point of view that that whole area was originally a very large island. And on the same website, you will find the very latest geological information showing that it was a rift faulting zone on the mid-Atlantic ridge. And two other key figures here are Derek Allen and Bernard Dallaire, who wrote a book called Cataclysm. And you will see the massive vertical movements of the Earth's crust following this catastrophe at 10,850. You'll see, in fact, that the Azores were connected to North Africa. And so we've got a situation where not only have we a large island the size of Spain, but that island was originally connected to Africa. Hence, we have the record of elephants in the island of Atlantis and a lot of other material which was provided originally by the wisest lawmaker in Greece, who decided he would go to Egypt and learn all he could about history from the Egyptian priests. And he went to Egypt, to Sais, in about 650 BC. We're going to the very early historians, and that's where we have the stories also passed on by Plato. And so we have very good historical evidence, and we have the best possible scientific evidence from Christian O'Brien, who is unequaled in terms of his skills in geology. And his later skills, of course, were understanding a whole range of important languages, particularly understanding the origins of cuneiform, which was a picture language of which there were 500 simple signs for people. And so we actually have people who have gone into the history, into the detail, and can provide the solid historical evidence and scientific evidence to make statements about Atlantis being a real place where there was a real city and there were real people. And in a time when, of course, the Gulf Stream would have probably provided conditions for farming to have taken place during the Great Younger Dryas Ice Age, which was the biggest freeze-up we had for thousands and thousands of years, when 40% of the Earth's surface was frozen.
Wow. How do you think the catastrophe happened?
Well, Richard Firestone and his colleagues and many other people are very well aware of these issues. Wonderful research has been done. North America is a case in point in that North America was buried under ice, and when we had the axis shift, then we found America came out of that northern area. The North Pole moved to where it is now, more or less. And you had a big thaw, and you've got Lake Aziz, and you've got all those big dams bursting and flooding the whole of North America with massive floods and soil. It's water erosion, wall to wall in America, and that's what our geologists are telling us. And we also have this Clovis points, Flint points, and Folsom points. Clovis came first, and then we have a barrier of black sludge, and then we have the Folsom points following on from there. And so within the archaeology of the Americas and Mexico, we have this record of this terrible event.
Wow.
Which was literally fire from the sky. And all the ancient history carried down by the American tribes, for example, Richard Firestone has a whole list of which is a similar story about the floods, about people surviving on mountaintops, surviving in boats, and the message from their gods. And this is before the Great Catastrophe. The gods were around before the Great Catastrophe and were able to tell the ordinary people, go dig a large pit, cover it with logs and earth, and hide. We're going to have a problem. So the gods who were around at 10,850 were clever enough and bright enough to know that a great catastrophe was coming.
Wow. We'll be right back to talk about that a little bit more here with Edmund Marriage as our guest here at Beyond the Veil Radio. We'll be right back.
Greetings and welcome back, traveler. Before you is a door of which there is no key. However, you may enter when you lift the veil, so you may see.
We are back, Beyond the Veil Radio. Our guest, Edmund Marriage, and we're talking about the flood, and I just had one more thing I wanted to add about the Great Flood, and that's the Great Sphinx in Egypt. Apparently, there was a researcher named Schwaller de Lubitz back in the early 20th century who said that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Sphinx was there before the Great Flood, and that it had been there much, much longer than the 5,000 or 6,000 years that the historians were saying at the time. What do you know about the Sphinx, Edmund, and was it there before the Great Flood?
There have been a lot of floods. We had a massive flood in Sumer, which flooded Sumer, and that is Noah's flood. That's the flood where we have the records from Sumer of a very much more recent flood, which the archaeologists, Woolley, excavated at Ur, and they found the clay and then found buildings beneath the clay. So there was a very significant flood in the area of the two rivers, Mesopotamia, the area between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, which is a flood specific to the Sumerian history. And that's important. There have been a lot of floods, and that was something probably around between 3,000 and 4,000 BC. We have another flood, 6,500 BC, which was almost certainly caused by a very large lump of cometary debris going into the Indian Ocean from west to east and creating a wave which built up what are called chevrons, large banks of sea material, gravel, shells, everything, 650 feet high, the Fenembosi chevrons right down the west coast of Madagascar. That put so much water into the air, we then had the 1,000-year storm and the flooding of the Jordan Valley, which is referred to in the ancient texts and for which we have very solid geological, archaeological evidence at Jericho. And we believe that the settlement of the Annunaki below Mount Hermon at Karsag, which meant head enclosure, that was in fact destroyed 3,000 years after it was created by the Shining Ones. And so they're just two floods. But the really serious flood was, of course, when the Earth tipped on its axis. And that's when you have sea water literally flooding across the United States. A very large amount of that seawater settling, which is now Lake Bonneville and all those great salt lakes, which had to come from somewhere, and that was almost certainly seawater ending up in depressions in those areas, creating those particular conditions. And that massive flood, which reshaped the surface of the Earth and caused massive vertical movements in the Earth's crust. Bernard Dallaire tells me that off the coast of New Zealand, we actually have geological records of 50-mile vertical movements in the Earth's crust. And we also have the Kerguelen Plateau under the Indian Ocean, which has been up and down 4 or 5 times in history. So the Earth's crust is literally sitting on fluid, and it's been up and down a lot. And this particular catastrophe at 10,850 and the flood that went across America has literally reshaped the planet. And so it's very difficult for us to really see or work out what happened prior to 10,850. We know that the flash from the supernova explosion at 49,000 BC ties in with the extinction of the giant kangaroo. Would you believe there was a giant kangaroo, there was a giant camel, there was saber-toothed tigers, the whole range of animals were much larger, even people were much larger, because we had a much denser atmosphere before the Earth was tipped on its axis and a large chunk of our atmosphere removed. I mean, we may well find eventually that Mars lost the last remnants of its atmosphere, perhaps a very large chunk of that atmosphere, at the same time, 10,850.
Wow.
The more work we do on Mars, we're finding all the evidence for water and life. And it was when we had all this cometary debris blasting through our solar system, moving Venus out of orbit, for example. Our astrophysicists are beginning to understand so much more, and how we managed, thanks to the Shining Ones, we managed as a human race to survive and that terrible disaster. And we don't really know how they did it, but we do know that they were very advanced. And this is the difficulty in getting people to realize that past knowledge was very much more advanced than we are even today.
Well, in order to survive something as catastrophic as a pole shift, you would have to have some basic knowledge of astronomy. And I think we're going to go into that after the next break. I think we're going to hit another break here in a minute. But briefly, can you tell us about observational astronomy in Jericho before 9000 BC?
Yes, all the records we have, but in particular from the books of Enoch, particularly the Secrets of Enoch and the translation that Christian O'Brien conducted on the books of Enoch, which was important enough to be part of the church canon in 295. There are many referrals to the angels watching the stars, seeing the stars, observing the stars. It was one of the key jobs of the watchers and the angels to observe the stars, the moon, the sun, and understand the cycle. So you have within the biblical records and the Sumerian records and the books of Enoch, you have references to observational astronomy. This is where O'Brien started by realizing that there was a line of stones exactly 1 megalithic mile apart for 26 megalithic miles across the Essex and Cambridgeshire countryside, which he called Line A. And that particular Line A was curved. In other words, the people who constructed it in 2,500 BC knew the exact dimensions of the Earth in order to be able to build that line. And so we have, back to the Sphinx, we're looking at a structure which points due east. And remember, the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, and all the pyramids are aligned to the 4 points of the compass. That requires incredible advanced knowledge and skill. Now, the Sphinx is water-worn, and we didn't have water at the time the Sphinx was built. Egypt was and the Sahara was beginning to dry out. It reached a peak of wetness, so to speak, with Lake Chad at about 4,400. And so we're looking at the Sphinx certainly being older than 4,400 when there was a much higher rainfall, and that shows up in the erosion of the Sphinx enclosure. And Robert Slosh worked that one out, and I think he's supported by many, many people.
Wow. Well, we're hitting a break again, so we'll get right back to that observational astronomy in ancient Jericho before 9000 BC. It's incredible. We'll be right back. Was there proof of an advanced civilization in Jericho, of all places, before 9000 BC? We have Edmund Marriage on the line talking to us about this subject. Edmund, where is the proof that we had an advanced civilization in Jericho before 9000 BC?
Well, the issue which we were talking about was this issue of observational astronomy. And I tried just to the parallels of how important observational astronomy is. And the Jerusalem University team, one of the professors involved, I think, was called Barkai. They worked on their thesis was that the Jericho Tower, which was quite significant structure with wonderful stonework, as good as any medieval castle. That tower, linked to a marker on the side of the valley, actually allowed the residents of Jericho to see the summer and winter solstices. Now, the solstice is that point where the sun is moving north in the summer and moving south in the winter. And there's a point where it stops and it comes to a standstill and then goes back again. So you're observing the movement of the sun to work out exactly where midwinter is and midsummer is. And that's a fundamental measure in terms of working out the calendar for the seasons and time. And that is what we see at Jericho and dated to 9,500 BC. So the people in Jericho were using observational astronomy to work out time and calendars, all the things that are important for life and agriculture and everything else. Jericho in itself is the historical evidence is there. One of the most interesting features, which is mentioned by the Jerusalem University team, is that there is still lime plaster on the base of the Jericho Tower. And they used plaster in the houses, which were changed from round houses to square houses. So you had a different type of people. The whole thing completely changed between what is called pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B, a sudden arrival of a very bright group of people. And the invention of lime is terribly important, because you cannot have farming unless you neutralize the acidity of the soil and add lime to get the correct acidity for growing whatever plants you want to grow. And that setting of the pH level is the first task you do in any country of the world today. When you want to grow crops, you have to set the soil in the right condition. And we find all those techniques of producing fertile soil ready to receive domesticated crops and seeds arriving along with those domesticated crops and seeds and quite different domestic animals. I'll go back to the Sphinx and make the point that the Sphinx was facing due east. So whoever set the Sphinx out knew exactly what the mathematics was of the Sphinx's position. And Robert Temple thought perhaps that the Sphinx was originally Anubis, which was a key animal for the Egyptians. I go one further and suggest that the Sphinx was in fact a cheetah, and then the head was recarved. And the reason I mention that was because the cheetah was one of the most amazing acts of cloning carried out by the Shining Ones, because the cheetah is a cross between a dog and a cat. It has all the features of both dogs and cats mixed to provide a wonderful animal which you could go hunting small game with in the Sahara when it was wet and full of wildlife. And so my speculative view, but I think it adds up to the knowledge we now have, is that the Sphinx was originally a cheetah. The word Sphinx itself can be applied to a cheetah, and that was cheetah is a clone, and it's a very, very important part of the evidence whereby all our domesticated animals changed very dramatically from their wild counterparts.
Wow. And so people went from the Neolithic A was basically hunter-gatherers, very simple crops, to making concrete and pouring plaster and using lime for your crops and that kind of thing in Neolithic B?
Yes, all of a sudden it arrives, and you have the Natufian groups, small villages where they were collecting wild seeds, which are hardly edible and not very nutritional. and all of a sudden they suddenly changed to the domesticated crops. The first domesticated crop we have clear evidence on is the fig at 9,500 at Gilgal II, and it's a parthenic fig, which means it has to be fertilized by the involvement of human beings, of man. And this is the key factor in all our domesticated crops. It needs man's guiding hand to sow it at the right time, harvest it at the right time. And with the grains, for example, very, very subtle differences which allow grain to be harvested, carried home, thrashed, and you have the stalk or the gloom, which is precisely suited to not losing all the seeds in the rain and the wind before you harvest, but being able to take the seed head with you and then thrash the grain out. It's a very, very delicate and distinct process of domestication.
This was around the same time that poppies were being grown around the world with the same kind of purpose. It has to be done by an actual person, and you have to harvest it correctly and that kind of thing in order to produce opium, correct?
Yes, so these people were displaying a vast knowledge of botany, of science, and they were restarting civilization all over again.
Mm-hmm.
And they must have brought seeds with them. That's my view. And so we have a record of Manu's cache of seeds, which can be translated as An or Anu's cache of seeds, which may well have been below Mount Hermon, the site, which was a wonderful site, which would have protected them from the Great Flood, stable land, and then wonderful soil at the headwaters of the Jordan, where everything restarted. So we don't have exact details, but we have enough science now to tell us that something very special changed and happened. It wasn't a slow process of experimenting over hundreds of years with useless, undigestible seeds. It was people who had brought the whole package from somewhere else. So we've got to get our heads around the fact that we are the product of an advanced civilization who were totally benevolent, who gave us all the instructions to how we should run our social organization, and who we have forgotten all about or have been taught not to believe, which has left us in the muddle we're in today.
Wow. And they centered in the Rashaya Aya Basin site, which you're claiming is the Garden of Eden.
That's right. You have a wonderful south-facing slope below Mount Hermon. You have the great house, the meeting place of the Divine Council, looking over the North Rashaya Basin and South Rashaya Basin. We even have the waterworks, the system they were using then, in the cast limestone.
Wow, and these are our ancestors. So we'll talk about who those ancestors were right on the other side here at Beyond the Veil.
Hour number 3 coming up.
Preparing to initiate phase 3 momentarily. Brace yourself, traveler. We are about to venture into the realms of the unknown. www.beyondtheveilradio.com.
Real people, real radio. Wherever you are, make it TFR. Truth Frequency Radio.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting.
Welcome, fellow traveler, to phase 3 of this journey. Here you will experience an even deeper level of understanding as we traverse through the boundaries of hyperspace consciousness. Here, you will find that reality is altered with a single thought and a single intention. Set your intention now and prepare to travel deeper.
Deeper, deeper, deeper.
Beyond the veil.
Extremely fascinating discussion with philosopher and political analyst Edmund Marriage. I'm so glad that we were able to get him on for the full 3 hours, because I had a feeling when I first spoke to him a few weeks ago that we were going to need plenty of time to go over the material. So people have been writing and saying that they haven't been hearing enough from Cherie Gio, so I'm going to hand it back over to Cherie, who's been doing a wonderful job this evening.
Thank you.
Take us away.
Yeah, the Great Flood that happened 12,000 years ago no doubt destroyed many, many, many species of life on this planet, and very well could have destroyed humanity completely if it were not for our ancestors, this beautiful group of people that rebirthed culture after the Great Flood 12,000 years ago. Edmund, who were our ancestors? Who were these wonderful people?
Well, I think the first thing we look at is the DNA of everybody on the planet today, including the Aborigines and the South American Indians, everybody on the planet. And I think I'm right in saying that the M158 marker actually tells us that we are all closely related. In other words, every single person on the planet is closely related. We know from the records, some of it's mentioned in the Bible, but the analysis of that is that the Shining Ones were using in vitro fertilization, as we do every day now in the world. And they needed that to be able to have skilled workers to do the jobs and to do the work. And they used that particular method in the building of knowledge, which was run by a lady, Ninkasag. Originally she was called Ninil, a wife of Enlil, and then she was made the governor of the Garden of Eden, and she became Ninkasag. She's got many other names like Ma, and she's the Earth Mother Goddess. She's called Mari, when the city was called Mari, and Mari is the goddess of the Basque. We go right the way across Asia and find that Kali, the same, and she ends up by being called Kotaliku in the Americas. So she's an international goddess, if you like, but over time she's turned into a very capable woman in a world where women had total equality to men, and I mean that. She is then portrayed in the Americas by the Aztecs as a great stone statue covered in snakes. And of course, they confuse snakes with the serpent word. The serpent word has nothing to do with snakes. The serpent word is wise men and women. And the angels and the archangels were called one-eyed serpents if they were an angel, or two-eyed serpents if they were senior and an archangel. And then we have the third order of craftsmen were called watchers. And the idea that you've got two eyes on the job or one eye on the job, or you're watching. It's the concept of intelligence. And you even have the figures with four heads and eyes looking in four different directions for the most knowledgeable people. And so that's a little bit of history there. I will touch on women because it's so important, because our current world, women have a terrible time because our religion, probably more than anything else, has diminished the role of women. In the Sumerian city-states, in Egypt, there's a lot of recent material in Egypt of how equal women were in every respect. And certainly in the towns and villages of Mesopotamia, every king had either a wife or a consort. And the word Yahweh, which we use as God, simply means leader. And Asherah means some sort of female god, but it was always the wife or consort. So it was Yahweh and Asherah of every town, village, etc. And that's where we still get the tradition of mayor and mayoress. There was always a man and a woman carrying out their specific roles, the men doing the jobs that they always do well, but women doing all the jobs and supervising all the things that they do within their crafts and trades.
Well, and if you look at the Native American culture, I hate to interrupt, but the Native American culture is the exact same way. The ancient Native American cultures were primarily matriarchal, in that the women decided what everyone was going to do, and they were more the administrators, while the men were the warriors.
Yeah, well, the Muso and the Naga in the Himalayas, you have a situation where women choose who they have sex with. As simple as that. And that men do not advance upon a woman unless they're invited, which is a great idea, particularly to control the population. So women know the cycles of the moon, they should do, and when they're likely to get pregnant and not get pregnant. So the law basically was, or the custom was, we had more customs because everybody observed the customs. They hate laws, they don't observe the laws. But the customs were that if you wanted to be friendly to a woman, you were greatly encouraged because you might be rewarded by sex at the end of the day. But it gave them the upper hand. And just imagine if women have the upper hand on that one issue. Just think how much better it would be, particularly in Ireland on a Saturday night and other parts of the world, where women choose who they have sex with. And apparently the method was to quietly hold a man's hand and just rub the inside of his palm with your finger. And that was the message. And so very discreet, very well organized, entirely under the control of the woman. That would transform our population problems and transform the role of women. And all the men would be terribly nice to all the women.
Yes, they would. They would always be very, very nice to women, because not only that, but I noticed that cultures that have a strong matriarchal heritage to them are much less warlike and much less likely to be engaged in wars of aggression that involves taking the land that belongs to other people and then claiming it as your own. The Native Americans never had any problems with that. The only one that I can remember would be the Aztecs. Those were the only ones that ever expanded and took slaves and treated them terribly and murdered them. When in a matriarchal society, that doesn't happen because the wise grandmothers are the ones that are the generals. They're the ones making all the decisions of whether to go to war or not. And so if they were going to go to war, it was always with set rules of how long it was going to last and what the terms were going to be if one lost or the other one lost. And when the war was over, it was over. Everyone went back home and nobody thought of getting revenge or, taking them back to war because that was the terms.
Yeah, the male and female druids, and the role of a druid was to, if you two men wanted to fight and take their armies against each other, the druid would stand in the middle and say, "Stop." What we're going to want you two chaps who are leading these two armies, we want you to set it out in combat between the two of you. We only want two people here to risk death, and so you can have a combat between the two of you in front of your armies.
Absolutely. And we'll be right back to talk about our ancestors, and we're going to go a little bit more into the history of Britain right on the other side here at Beyond the Veil.
my dear traveler, remember this. Whatever plane our consciousness may be acting in, both we and the things belonging to the plane are, for the time being, our only realities. However, if we mistake the shadows for realities, we find ourselves confusing the upward progress of the ego as an elevation of consciousness. Thus, beware of oneself when you step beyond the veil.
With all the research that I have done throughout the years and into alternative history, I've never spent that much time on the Druids. So I'm really glad that we have Edmund here with us to talk about this, because I don't even know what the Druids really believed, and I've never done that much research on them. So Edmund, take us away. Who were the Druids?
Well, the Druids were the descendants of the Tuatha De Danann. And the Tuatha De Danann were the people of the god An, and that means really the descendants of the god An. And we also have the tribe of Dan, which was southern Lebanon, very close to Karsag, who were the great mariners and sailors from the very earliest times. And so Druids really was an extension of the beliefs of the Annunaki at Karsag in southern Lebanon. And if we follow the DNA and on all our up-to-date knowledge, we find that the movement of people stems from that area in southern Lebanon, in particular from the ports of Tyre and Sidon, also Beirut later. But Tyre and Sidon are two of the oldest cities, not older than Damascus, Damascus being the oldest city of all, which is, in Arabic, is called Esh Shams. And Shamesh, and the origin of shamanism, comes from Shamesh, who was the Shining One, who was the lawmaker of the Shining Ones. And so we've got to look at that history from that point of view. So the Druids are representatives of the oldest way of doing things, not a religion, the oldest way of doing things. And if we look at the Brahman in India, we look at Buddha, we look at Hindus. Hindus talk about the Vedas, which are the Shining Ones. Buddha talks about follow the Shining Ones. And so every religion on the planet can be found to go back to the Shining Ones and Druidism. And we have a situation where, because of the wipeout, because of massive climate change, floods, etc., and this great catastrophe at 2345, and the natural expansion of the city-states, we find people coming into Britain as early as 6000 BC, bringing the domesticated crops with them. And we've found recently, in the last year, domesticated wheat and barley in the area under the sea between England and the Isle of Wight, which is off the southern coast of Britain. And we also find people, farmers coming into Britain on not only in Pembrokeshire in Wales, but side fields on the coast of Ireland and onto the Salisbury Plain. And so we've got people migrating into Britain from the most civilized parts of Sumer and in particular the Eastern Mediterranean, centering on the land of Canaan. Now, these were the great builders of the world, effectively. And on the Golden Age Project website, that's .org.uk, you'll see a wonderful poem from a wonderful man, Dionysius of Susa, who tells you the whole world story, that how but we all evolved from that area of southern Lebanon, which ties in again with the DNA information we now have. And we're farming officially recognized as starting at 9,500 BC. So what I'm telling you is backed by science and bioarchaeological science. And we can follow the trail of people across the Mediterranean, around the coast of Spain to Britain by sea, which was by far the best means of transport. We can also follow the trail of farming across Europe. And the Druids, in fact, were they're sometimes called Celts, but they were the more civilized people who took the knowledge from the very civilized areas of Sumer to the British Isles. At the same time, we find Sargon I, a very famous king who really founded Sumer, which was a confederation of the Sumerian city-states, and they colonized the Indus Valley. Menes was the son of Sargon I and moved as governor from the Indus Valley to Egypt to join the two parts of Egypt. And we can see Sargon I also being recorded by Terrien Le Couperie, one of the great French archaeologists, as the man who led the Bak-Sing tribes when they had to leave Sumer, and they went down the Silk Road, some going into Persia, some into India, but providing the foundations for China round about 2700 BC. So China, we find China has exactly the same pictorial writing origins as Sumer. And that's very well known, but very rarely talked about by our academics.
Edmund, it's difficult. Let me jump in for a moment. It's difficult to mention the Druids without asking naturally about Stonehenge. Any insight into that ancient site?
Yes, Stonehenge is straightforward. In the first instance, they moved the blue stones to Stonehenge from Preseli. The blue stones are the one material in the world and the only place in Britain where you have that monatomic energy. They're created when comets hit the ground, and they're a very, very high percentage of monatomic elements. Lawrence Gardner wrote a book about it, tied in with the white powdered gold, which is another story. But Stonehenge was used for people to sit in the middle of that circle of Preseli rock, unique rock, and set in a magnetic field which would allow them to balance their brainwaves. Now we now know from science that if we can balance our brainwaves, then the body heals itself. We can remove illness, all sorts of things. And so understanding that we are electrical, and if we sit in the right magnetic field or electromagnetic field, then our brains can, the connectors in the brain can unfuzz or realign, and that gives us a healthy body, a healthy electrical body, and removes most of the problems, or nearly all the problems. They understood that. That was the National Health Service method. Now, when they realized that there was going to be a great catastrophe, right about 2600, exactly the same time as the pyramids were being built, they knew that we could have another major astronomical catastrophe. So we find the henges, which were used for observing the sun and the moon and the stars, as well as this magnetic process using a monatomic elements of Stonehenge.
Fantastic. Hold right there, ladies and gentlemen. Much more coming up with Edmund Marriage right here on Beyond the Veil. Maybe we can get into some more ancient sites and ancient history. I'm still going to keep handing it over to Cherie, though. Don't go anywhere.